Hey, thanks everybody for waiting. First of all, you're very welcome to today's event, Young People in Substance Use. This is the fourth of our online seminar series that ASCERT have been conducting over this year. And we've had some previous events looking at other issues such as women and alcohol, addiction and gambling, and addiction and trauma. This is the last event of our series this year, but we'll be doing some more next year. I'm very pleased to have so many people who have come along today and registered for this event. I'm sure you'll find it very informative and interesting. We've got a great range of speakers. Dr. Campbell from Queen's University, the providers of youth treatment services in Northern Ireland, and Fiona Anderson, Preeti, Yellamaty, and Stephanie McKernan today with us, and Professor Eilish Gilvarry, who will be joining us a little bit later on. So the running order today is that we'll be having some of our speakers doing their presentations just as soon as I finish here now, through to around 10 or 5 to 11, and then we'll take a short break, a comfort break for everyone, and then we'll come back, have our final speaker, and then we're going to have in the remaining time until 12:30, have a question and answer session. So the way that works is that you'll see that on your dashboard that you have on your screen that you've got a Q&A box. So that's different than the chat box. If you have any questions that you want to be put to the panel, then please put them in the Q&A box. And you'll see whenever you put questions in that you can like other people's questions as well. So those questions which get the most likes will go to the top of the queue, and we'll pick some of those questions and put them to one or all of the panelists to kind of prompt discussion. And also a recording of this seminar will be available after the event to anyone who has registered. Okay, so let's kick off with our first speaker. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Campbell. Anne is a reader in mental health and substance use at Queen's University. She's the program director for the Masters in Substance Use and Substance Use Disorders at Queen's. She's also a member of the Advisory Council for the Misuse of Drugs and co-director of the Drug and Alcohol Research Network. So Anne, you're very welcome. So I'll just hand over to you.
Thanks, Gary. Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here this morning and speaking at ASCERT's final seminar in the series, which marked their anniversary year. I have a background in drug and alcohol research across working with different subgroups, but we just finished a project there about 1.5 years ago in relation to working with novel psychoactive substances and young people and their views on that across Northern Ireland as part of what's called the Belfast Youth Development Study, which was a longitudinal study, started way back in 2000. So involved in that in terms of young people, and also involved in the ACMD in writing a report on young people and drug use across the 4 nations, including Northern Ireland, of course. This morning, I'm going to be looking, just setting the context for this morning, I think I'm just going to be looking at some substance use trends across the island of Ireland. My colleague, Professor Gilvarry, will look at trends within UK. So I thought I would go in a different direction and look at it across from a Northern Ireland perspective and also from an all Ireland perspective. So just telling you the content: general prevalence across the island of Ireland, trends in substance use treatment populations, and then just a quick overview of ongoing issues which have been reported primarily in an anecdotal fashion from within my own work at the CIS project through ASCERT and through other conversations with other colleagues across the drug and alcohol sector in Northern Ireland. So 2 primary studies that take place within Ireland. I mean, there are a number of studies, including NDAS, which is the National Drug and Alcohol Survey, which is an all population study. It just does not focus on young people. So the 2 that I've looked at here are the My Word survey, run by UCD and National Centre for Youth Mental Health, and that was run in 2012, with a follow-up study in 2019, and it looked at around 11,000 adolescents aged 12 to 18 years and 8,000 or so young adults aged 18 to 25 in third level education or employment. And the other study,
I'm sorry,
yep.
Can I interrupt you? You're not sharing your screen?
Oh,
if you have a presentation.
I do.
Right.
Okay, Gary. I thought I had shared it. Bear with me. I'll just come out of it. Okay. So we practice this and everything, Gary. My goodness, right?
these things happen.
Yeah. Hold on a second.
There'll be a dog jumping through one of the backgrounds at some point this morning as well, I'm sure.
Oh, my dog will probably sit and mind me at one point, so just bear with me. Hopefully you can see that now.
Yeah, I should just under the slide.
Yes.
Slide
right, can you see that? Good.
Thank you.
Good job. Right, I'll just skip through that. So 2 surveys that we're looking at in Ireland. The My World survey, as I say, 2 cohorts, one in 2012 and one in 2019. And alongside that, the Growing Up in Ireland survey, 2006, and more recently looked at a wave of young people had come through who were age 9, 13, 7 to 18, and in this new wave who were 20 years old. And that fieldwork was conducted in 2018 and 19. And just looking at, it's difficult to compare across surveys because they use different measures at different times in different ways and different types of analysis, but we'll make some sort of summary comparisons, I suppose, in relation to how that fits in with the Northern Ireland context. Okay, let's jump on. Okay, so in the My Word survey results, the percentage of adolescents who hadn't drank alcohol compared with the first wave in 2012, that had increased. So there's an increase in the numbers of people or young people who did not drink alcohol from 2012 to 2019. However, problematic alcohol use was similar to that in terms of levels from across the 2 surveys, and at both junctures they were associated with really severe feelings of anxiety and depression among adolescents. 15% reported in the My Word survey that they had smoked cannabis. Now, this trend, the reported use of cannabis in first year of secondary school, went from 3 to 27% in 5th year and 36% in 6th year. And that is sort of reminiscent, obviously, of the level of cannabis use across all the surveys that we've looked at. So that increases usually across age groups and across school years. Of those who reported having smoked cannabis, 43% reported that they were aged 15 years. And this number, age 15, keeps coming up again and again in the survey data. And it seems to be a really pivotal number in terms of initiation of drug use and people presenting for services and so on across all the surveys. So it's an interesting observation. In terms of alcohol behaviour, again, looking between the 2, 2012 for My Word survey and 2019, we can see the levels of low risk drinking. The light blue is survey 1, the dark blue is survey 2 in 2019. So low risk drinking has reduced, and problem drinking, we see there, has increased from 15 to 28% of the cohorts, hazardous from 3 to 5%, and possible alcohol dependence from 3 to 4%. And they were measured using a tool called audit, which most people will be familiar with, and the audit looks at these 4 domains. Okay. I'm just moving my thing about here. So smoking cannabis. Cannabis comes through time and time again in these surveys as being the most popular drug in general, prevalence terms, and also the drug that is most frequently cited as the major problem within treatment populations. So we see usually quite high levels of cannabis reporting. The DAST questionnaire was used to look at drug problems, and nearly 50% of young adults presented with no drug problems. But within the remainder of that, 37% had low drug problems, 10% according to DAST in the moderate level, and 2% in substantial, 1 in severe. Again, in the same way as alcohol, the problematic drug use was significantly associated with severe depression and severe anxiety. And this is something that we know, the workers here know, that dual diagnosis is a huge issue, and increasingly so for our young people in Northern Ireland and Ireland. The second of the surveys for Ireland then, this is the cohort of the Growing Up in Ireland survey on the 5th wave, i.e. in relation to people who are 20 years old. So unsurprisingly, 96% of those 20-year-olds had consumed alcohol. Again, on average, respondents were 15, going on 16 when they had their first alcoholic drink. And again, the highest percentage reported that they had tried cannabis, and 18% took it occasionally, 6% ingested cannabis more than once a week. And again, there's that movement up the line in relation to the marked increase as young people move through their teens. From 1% tried cannabis by age 13, that would be our year 8, 30% had tried it by age 17, 18, and the current cohort, 59% by age 20. Other illicit drug use, ecstasy and cocaine, which we have seen an increase in our counterparts in the UK. We have an increase in powder cocaine. We also see it in the Republic of Ireland as well. And 9% at 20 years of age had used prescription use for recreational purposes. So on to Northern Ireland. I'm just trying to move pictures of people up so I can see the writing here. Sorry, bear with me. So the Northern Ireland Young Persons Behaviour Attitude Survey is probably the most consistent and reliable survey that we have in terms of an overview of our drug use and alcohol use in young people. We did have a study called BIDS, the Belfast Youth and Development Study, which was the largest cohort, longitudinal cohort study in the UK, based here in Belfast at Queen's. And I think we had our last wave of that in 2010, 2011. We did follow up that cohort for the MPS, the Novel Psychoactive Substances research project that I was involved in. And we found that there were many problems with MPS at that time in 2018 through 2019, chiefly with synthetic cannabinoids and pregabalin and Lyrica. And also the polydrug context was to the fore as well within that cohort, probably for the first time since 2010, 2011, when it was last recorded. So the general prevalence survey then, Young Persons Behaviour and Attitude Survey, asks a range of questions, but it does focus on drugs and alcohol. And we've had it sweep at 2000, 2003, 7, 10, 13, 16, and 19. So it's a nice longitudinal study, which gives us real sort of validity in our results across time. So sorry about that sort of block across there. I don't know where that came from. So proportion of young people reporting to have ever taken an alcoholic drink has, as you can see, decreased from 2000. All is the blue column here, and moving down from around just under what 58, 59% down to about 25% there. So that's a marked decrease in consumption of an alcoholic drink. For those who had a drink and had ever been drunk, we also have a decrease from 2000 of around 60% to just over 40%. So you can see that marked decrease across occasional drinkers and people who have ever been drunk when they take an alcoholic drink. Okay, and of those people, proportion of young people that drink alcohol that have ever reported using drugs, again, and this is a trend that we're seeing, folks, across the UK, we have that decrease in lifetime use, in last year use, that orange line there, and in last month use from 25% to just over 5%, going up slightly there, verging towards the 10% again. Okay, in terms of alcohol then, for young people in Northern Ireland, the proportion of young people reporting to ever having taken an alcoholic drink. Again, look at that sweep up again in the year group, reminiscent and mirrored by the results from our colleagues in ROI and indeed in the UK. So that does increase exponentially as we move through the year groups. Surprisingly, we're looking at the multiple deprivation measure. There is very little differentiation between the most deprived quintile to the least deprived quintile. Okay. Okay, so in terms of drugs, a small proportion, we're talking about YPBS, that last week there was 8,118 young people surveyed. So a small proportion of them reported ever using drugs. So that 5% represents about 200 respondents in that sample. However, more than half of the young people who had been offered drugs had first been offered them aged 13 or younger. So that's your general population figures, and that there is that sort of decrease in terms of numbers reporting. In terms of treatment, let's go back down south. They have a very comprehensive system of data gathering called the NDTRS, and our colleagues in England have the NDTMS. So it's a comprehensive database of information gathered from very rigorously from a number of agencies, including drug treatment centres, GPs, residential rehabilitation units and prison. And it has been gathered consistently since 1995, I think, yeah. And usually there's about 30,000 records gathered annually in a consistent way. So again, from the treatment database, we're seeing now, we went from general population to a focused treatment database. We're seeing a decrease from 163 in 2014. In 2014, there was 163 in the treatment database for alcohol-based problems. And in 2020, we see there where the cursor is, 99 cases. So it has decreased from 2014. This is unpublished data from the NDTRS, so it's not widely available because of because it's the under 18s basically, and it hadn't been published at the time going to press. In the 18 to 24 age group, we have 403 cases entered alcohol treatment in that period in 2020, 68% male, nearly 50% more than one substance, which we see time and time again as polydrug use takes over, and 250, 62% were new cases. The NDTRS does not hold information on continuation of care in terms of cases as new cases and repeat cases, so I suppose that's a gap. But they have, in saying that, they have a very consistent way of, and comprehensive way of gathering the data and analysing it. Drug treatment then for the under 18, surprisingly, there was over 100 for alcohol. Here we have 674 cases entering drug treatment under the age of 18 in 2020. Majority male, 90%, and again hitting 50% in polydrug use. 18 to 24, we've nearly 2,000 cases entering drug treatment in the same time frame. Majority treatment for cannabis. So if you look at the under 18s, we have 85.9% of the under 18s for cannabis. Here it drops down to 38.4 for the 18s to 24. And I think it's important when we think about young people, we seem to blanket, you know, the whole age group in some publications, but it's good to differentiate between the under 18s who have their own set of problems as opposed to the 18 to 24 year olds who have a different set of problems based more on the polydrug use trajectory. Okay, so treatment in Northern Ireland. Just checking time here. Okay, good. Treatment in Northern Ireland. So I've given references, folks, and this will be posted online later. The people want to check up this data. It's interesting when we're thinking about policy development and workforce development and treatment on the ground. We really have to know our figures and our statistics in terms of giving us an overview of our direction. So the treatment figures in Northern Ireland, I'll just move things about here and have a look at that. So we've taken the stats from the Northern Ireland Substance Misuse Database for 2019 to 20. I've also put in a reference for people if they want to click on that. That's the government, the UK government equivalent as well for young people's substance misuse treatment statistics. And I'm not going to go into detail because I haven't got the time, and I know Eilish, as I say, is going to talk a bit about that. So we don't want to overlap on that. Okay, so we have, there are one or two things. Now the substance misuse database is very good at what it does. It gives a great overview of people in treatment. There are some concerns that may be slightly underreporting those people in treatment. And as I looked at this as well, I thought there are certain gaps in terms of differentiating between younger people and older people, which the UK government seems to have grasped and the ROI government seems to have grasped. So we're a wee bit more sort of we're slightly less detailed, I suppose, in terms of our presentation of the data and differentiating across age groups. Okay, so we've some quite basic stuff here. Client age group is referred to in terms of who takes drugs only, who presents to the treatment database with drugs and alcohol problems, and who is there primarily because of alcohol problems. So under 18, we've no numbers on this, so we're taking an educated guess that this is around 15% under 18 years are drug only, and then down to about 4 or 5% drug and alcohol, and a couple of percent on alcohol only. Now this jumps considerably when we move to the different level of younger people between the 18 and 25 years age group, and we're almost at the 40% there, which is similar to our 26 to 39 year age group. So considerable jump between these two sections of our young people, and the same for drugs and alcohol as well. Okay. Okay, that's not moving. Okay, I don't seem to be moving, folks. Oh, I've moved. Right. Okay. So stats from the SMD continued. Same drug misuse database, and I was trying to untangle some stuff in relation to young people, and this infographic gives an overview of the majority of the drugs that are most used by people who present for treatment. So cannabis 65.2%. We know and expect that. Cocaine creeping up over the years to 46% of all our clients, including adults and young people. Benzos 31% of all clients, and pregabalin and Narga 22% of all clients. Now, if we look at this small graph here, hope you can see my cursor. You look at the line here in comparison with the rest of these. For cannabis, the under 18 years is hitting a percentage of that sub cohort are hitting around 97%. And peaking there at around 50, 60, 65 to 70% for 18 to 25. And as people get older, they present less and less with cannabis as the primary problem. In terms of cocaine, interestingly, 46%, the under 18s just under 20, and it peaks there at just about 45 to 50% for the 18 to 25, and peaks at almost 60% for that 26 to 39. So we still have an increase in problematic use between the under 18s and 18 to 25. For benzos, under 18s, we're starting around 20%. Our peak for benzos out of all the groups is for for our young persons within the 18 to 25 year group. Pregabalin, Lyrica, again, look, we're down at about 2-3% for our under 18s, but shooting right up there to about 25% for 18, plateauing across the 26, and going down for our older people. So for the cocaine, for cannabis, for cocaine, and benzos and pregabalin, the 18 to 25 is up there at the peak there of our people who are presenting within the drug misuse database, and that represents around 4,200 people who presented, whose information was presented last year for the substance misuse database. Okay. Am I on time here? And again, for alcohol, finally, for Northern Ireland, under 18s, 3.3% presented to treatment for alcohol misuse, or alcohol use problems, sorry, and 18 to 25 years, 16.4%, and it increases as people get older. So we don't have that peak here for alcohol, but we do for the drugs on the previous page. Okay, I'm trying to move these about here. So I keep getting everybody's pictures, so I have to move the pictures down and up, so bear with me. So issues in Northern Ireland, 15 years is the most common age of first contact with services, and that number 15 kept coming up time and time again throughout the different surveys, as I said before, as a first age of consumption or as an age for presentation at services. There's one anomaly there, and I didn't write it down, but I noted it to self, and that if you want to look up the NDAS survey for Ireland, then that age range has raised for that general population survey of the National Drug and Alcohol Survey for Ireland. That has now gone up to 17 between 2012 and 2019. So that's quite a different perspective. in relation to the stats there. However, there is an increase in over 18s coming through with more complex issues. We may be going down in the general population, but we have an increase in numbers presenting with complex issues. Main referrals are from social services and justice. They may be presenting with a range of primary issues. They will be presenting with a range of primary issues, I should have said, and substance use is often a secondary concern, not always, but often as a result of different multifaceted and complex issues, including trauma, poor mental health, these things we know, most commonly anxiety and depression, spelled wrong, family or relationship problems, and in Northern Ireland we have our own further exacerbation of problems via the paramilitary threat and violence and exclusion. Some stuff from NIDA that was presented to the Young People's Conference for ACMD, estimated around 9,000 to 10,000 people, young people aged 11 to 25 years present to NIDA services. And I will not try to mention everybody because I'm bound to leave somebody out, but I know off the top of my head, Start 360, ASCERT, there I'm stopping already, Extern, Simon Community. So there's a whole range of organisations involved in NIADA, but they were managed to extrapolate some information in relation to the numbers that are presenting to our services. And those were mentioned again: dual diagnosis, polydrug use, earlier onset of drug use, along with complex family history we're seeing amongst our caseloads. Ongoing trends, not emerging, they used to be emerging, but now we would safely say they're ongoing. Alcohol, codeine, with codeine, pregabalin, various benzos that we all know. A lot of them are street benzos and counterfeits. We have a huge problems with our young people who are street homeless with counterfeit benzos and the mixing of polydrug use and really anything that can be got at any stage or any time, and a lot of problems with street coke as well. And increasingly now we're hearing of problems with crack in Belfast and Bangor, and I'm sure other areas in Northern Ireland. And it would be good to hear from the people in the audience about their thoughts on that. Yeah, heroin and substance use, a small proportion of our young service users are getting involved in relation to that, unfortunately. Extracting fentanyl from patches also to smoke or to chew. We have recurrent issues in residential childcare in Northern Ireland. And this is anecdotal, folks, as were the other issues that I've talked about. They're not evidence-based as yet. I think it's very important that we look to see what's happening in our residential care population, because I'm hearing from workers all the time in the field that they need more information and training and need more updated information in relation to those issues faced by our young people in the system. Extension of harm reduction for young people via peer education is very important. If we go back to the YPBS study, that overarching study for Northern Ireland, a number of young people said that the education information that they received was one of the main things that actually prevented them from taking alcohol or taking drugs, but also that education, having that knowledge and being informed was very helpful. So that's one end of providing information. The other end of providing information is for our young people who need the harm reduction message, who are visiting festivals, who are taking drugs recreationally and need that information. The LIP does a fantastic job over in England. I know that Dr. Ashling Diamond was trying to bring in some form of testing we would run the welfare tent, the medical tent at concerts, but I think that maybe later rather than sooner for us in Northern Ireland. So that level of harm reduction. And then we have another level of harm reduction whereby our young people that we see, particularly our street homeless and other young people who are maybe engaging in practices that are really not acceptable in terms of the risks to these young people. So for example, we had a few young people who started injecting straight into the groin with heroin and cocaine because of a myth and a rumor, a conjecture that was on the streets at the time. So peer education, harm reduction for those at the most vulnerable end of the drug using continuum. Finally, figures point overall to a decline in drug use among young people, but there is a sense amongst some services and people that I've talked to that it is the recording of drug use that is declining. So I just wanted to throw that in at the end. Do you think that it's been underreported to the substance misuse database? And do we need, folks, that consistent reporting that we see in the NTDRS treatment database for down south, and the NDTMS for the UK. And I think I've done that within time, Gary. Can't hear you. Oh.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Anne. Yes, that was you got it within time. In fact, we're 5 minutes short. So that's great. That's great. A really great presentation, and I think really sets the context really well. And I think that there are some kind of interesting kind of things coming out of that. I think it's the point you make about not looking at young people as a blanket kind of population. It's very clear from that kind of data. You have that difference between under 18 and 18 to 25, and then beyond. And I think that it is clear that in that kind of 18 to 39 age range, that those young adults, as you're seeing much more evidence of people who are not just using one type of substance or just alcohol, that poly substance use is the norm.
Yeah.
More so. And also I think that a point coming out of there too, which I picked up, was that levels of use aren't necessarily different depending on where you live, but in terms of health inequalities, depending on where you live, perhaps has an implication around the harm from that use.
Yeah,
because of other conditions, other factors. And I think also the point that you're making around the data which is available is relevant, considering the number of young people who are accessing services, or on those who are at a stage where they're not accessing services, but this is a very real issue for them, whereas the data is a lot more focused generally on the adult population.
Yes.
So I think that's a key kind of point. So thank you. We're going to move on to our next speakers. I think you ought to stop sharing your slides, Anne, to allow this to move on. Thank you. Okay, so our next speakers, it's a joint presentation from the providers of youth treatment services in Northern Ireland, the Public Health Agency Commission community-based youth treatment services for under 25s. And there are 3 providers across 2 services, without confusing things, and probably talk about insurance in the presentation. ASCERT, Start 360 and Dunlea addiction services are the providers of youth treatment services in different localities. So today we'll have Fiona Anderson from Start 360, Preeti Yellamaty from ASCERT, and Stephanie McKernan from Dunlea, who have kindly agreed to join us and share their thoughts from the front line. So I'm very interested in hearing this. I'll just hand over to Fiona, who's going to kick off. So thank you, Fiona.
Thanks very much, Gary, and thanks, Anne. That was a brilliant revision for me there on some of the research. So community-based regional substance youth treatment services. So really substance use support for young people 11 to 25 in the community. So as Gary said, Public Health Agency Commission services. I think we've been doing it for 15, 16 years now. And the 3 main organisations providing youth treatment services are Start 360 and ASCERT and Dunlea. So, and that is across the region. So any young person within the region has the access to that support. It's services in the round, I suppose, in around 1,000 young people come through support with us in a meaningful way. So we have therapeutic services, one-to-one support, family systemic support, family support. We also focus in on kind of educative and great work and stuff as well, in terms of targeting schools and communities as well who would respond quite positively for our kind of input. We have an open referral pathway. So it means anybody can refer to our services, and increasingly we have young people who are self-referrals as well. It was interesting looking at Anne's referrals there as well. I mean, it's the referral agents have changed over the COVID situation. We've had difficulty in receiving, referrals from particular statutory agencies as well, particularly GPs and things like that, because of access to services and stuff. So it'd be interesting to see, Anne, when we look at the data in the next couple of years, how things have changed. But in terms of our teams across the board, we have what we would call a multimodal team. So people come from youth work, counselling and social work backgrounds, and are all qualified and supported with workforce training as well in terms of supporting young people. You can go on to the next slide, Preeti. The most important thing when a young person refers to us, was interesting when you were talking about age groups there, Anne, as well. Age and stage is really important when we're providing support. Luckily, we don't have a lot of 11 and 12-year-olds, but the support that we would provide a 15-year-old could be quite significantly different from someone who's 24, depending again on what's happening. And obviously, again, looking at health inequalities, and we're ensuring that we are, targeting our services to those areas, urban areas, particularly in Belfast and places like Derry, who do feel those effects of the impact of health inequalities and how substance use does impact on that. So the age and stage is really important. Choice and readiness is really important as well. So it's a voluntary referral where the young person is really important. They decide to come along and they can pinpoint why they feel they need support around it. So we discussed that with young people as well in terms of, are they ready to explore why they're here, and are they and have they come along, and is it their choice? Because we know developing that relationship-based approach is really, really important. So we have a flexible service. Initially, I think until the last commissioning, we had our services up to age 21, but we lobbied Public Health Agency and said, look, we think the young people up to the day before their 26th birthday, we wanted to support them. We would contend that we would raise that youth age group even further, because we know the flexible kind of person-centered approach, which kind of rolls with the punches, not 3 strikes, no 3 appointments and you're out type statutory approach, works a lot better with the young people, who, particularly those who are experiencing kind of complex lives and chaotic lives. So it works very well. So we have bespoke kind of care and support planning, and we can do everything from brief interventions in terms of maybe doing a reducing use kind of approach, and we may have a longer term a relationship with the young person and their family where they will get one-to-one support along with family systemic support, family support. So it could be longer. So again, we don't have anything set in stone that says a young person has to come through the program within a period of time, because we know change, again, depending on age and stage, can be very different for everyone. And young people may go away and they come back again. We might see them when they're 15. We might see them again when they're 24. Sometimes, hopefully, we don't see them again. Again, the work is strengths led, so we're very much talking about what's strong in a young person as opposed to what's wrong, and ensuring that we are kind of using their strength as a platform for that change. I think in terms of, there's different approaches that we feel that will work with young people. So we might take a youth work, a diversionary approach to maybe bring young people in because they're not ready for the talking therapies. So we'll chip away at different approaches and constantly assess when a young person is ready maybe to get into the therapeutic work. And Preeti and Stephanie will talk a wee bit about their work as well in terms of how we go about that. In terms of, I suppose, looking at what young people come with, when we first started these services, and it's interesting to see, Anne as well, in terms of your we had a particular kind of young person that might have come along who was maybe using different substances, but they weren't coming along with the same problematic mental health issues. We're providing a mental health and substance use support service predominantly, as opposed to young people who are perhaps persistently offending under the influence or something like that. We're really, really feeling that young people are coming with anxiety and depression. We will have pockets of young people who will experience, quite intense mental health issues around drug-induced psychosis and things like that, but we do that in partnership with our mental health colleagues. And in terms of, providing that support, it's ongoing, looking at what we can do in terms of workforce training and looking at how we support young people and keeping on top of what we need to do that, and being on our, I suppose, up in our game as well. And again, looking at that flexibility. Partnership working is really, really important. And obviously with statutory services and other voluntary services, we do work very closely in terms of looking at I suppose a care and support plan for a young person and where we can bring people together to support them. Trickier when somebody's over 18, I think, and we're talking wider issues in terms of young people who have complex lives and perhaps are within the homeless or roofless population, and again, I mean, Gary might talk a wee bit about that in terms of Belfast and looking at the complex lives and how we support young people around that in a multidisciplinary approach. So in terms of I suppose the anecdotal evidence that we're getting through, some of the SMD stuff that's been reported, we would probably agree with that is maybe not a clear picture of what actually is going on. I suppose particularly with under 18s, young people are testing, dipping their toe in the water. It's normal risk-taking behaviour. So we don't really set in stone that a young person has an addiction or a problematic dependency. We know things can change from month to month, to week to week. And that age and stage and adolescent development is something we're very conscious of. And trying to support families in avoiding kind of the panic around that. And we know 15-year-olds are developing their sensitivity and empathy and independence, and they are a particular group. And I think that's always interesting that they come our way. So we would say our average would be a 15-year-old boy who'd be quite challenging in terms of supporting. Just a quick chat about the current trends that we are seeing generally. I suppose we want to promote that the rates of use have gone down, but what is concentrated is those young people coming through do have the problematic kind of mental health and substance use issues. So the picture has kind of been established in the last couple of years about who those young people who come through our services are. But some of the recent issues that we've been dealing with over the last couple of years, I mean, I've highlighted here, that are new. Teen vaping there, THC, and we're seeing that through advice from our schools as well. That has emerged in recent years. Alcohol and stimulant drinks such as Dragon Soup, that has raised its ugly head, unfortunately, and practitioners this week, actually, we were doing supervision this week, some practitioners, and they were discussing that with me. Obviously the opiate and injecting use, particularly amongst roofless and homeless young people who've come through the care continuum, is an ongoing issue and something that we're always concerned about. And again, working in partnership with other organisations and other strategy services in addressing that. But again, there's a lot of work going on in the background to address some of those issues, both within the care system, within statutory services, but also within the voluntary system as well, and within the councils. Poly drug use, poly substance use remains one of the most challenging parts of our work in terms of when young people present with their issues. Where do we start when they come with poly drug use and poly substance use? So that's where we really are holding a young person in terms of perhaps on a longer term basis in terms of supporting that complex life and perhaps a complex family life too. And again, what Anna talked about as well, we know all these substances are in the background as well, prescription drugs, ketamine, MDMA, cocaine, they're all there in the background. And we want to promote, obviously, that there are not a lot of 13-year-olds who are regularly using, you know, Class A drugs. We're not seeing them. However, there's a few different things that have happened over lockdown that we have highlighted anecdotally, obviously for us as well, but young people may be using their first substance within the family home because of lockdown, a trend that maybe wouldn't have been there before, or with siblings, older siblings, or with parents, or with carers. So there's a few different things that have occurred, I suppose, over the last couple of years. But in terms of going forward, we'll talk again at the end about some of the things that we would highlight as service providers, what we feel the future should be in terms of youth treatment, and where we would like to put a bit of emphasis in terms of supporting young people and their families. So that's me. I'm going to hand you over to Preeti, and she'll have a chat about some of the work we do. Thank you.
Hi everybody. I can't see anyone, but I'm told you're there. It's so good to have so many of you here. It shows a real need, isn't it, for knowledge, for getting, wanting to know what's happening, because this substance use affects us in so many different ways. We either know somebody personally or professionally, or we're working. Is important. It's good to have you. I'm going to just very briefly talk about service delivery in our, I know Stephanie is going to do the same. Even though we work with so various service users who are showing similar trends, drug trends, but our delivery tends to be different. And over COVID, it has changed. We've had to adapt. We've had to do, hybrid and blended ways of service delivery. When somebody says hybrid, I'm thinking of a car, but we've started to use these words during COVID. So quickly, drug trends again. Cannabis still is the most commonly used drug across the region. I was recently speaking to a PSNI officer who was telling me, that they seized a ridiculous amount of cannabis. I won't even go into details, but yeah, it's still out there. There's supply, there's demand, still shows that, it's available. Prescription drugs are still high in use, and you see it, we see that, it's very common in our service users, pregabalin, diazepam, all that stuff, synthetic drugs, all that stuff. I was speaking to a friend of mine who's a paramedic, and he was saying synthetic drugs are on the rise, and he was saying it's so hard to know when he goes out and he's, looking after, or he's is called in to look at two young people who've taken a synthetic drug. It's, both of them could say they've taken spice, but they're completely two different kinds of drugs, and which, it throws them in a dilemma. What do we do? How do we treat it? Alcohol still is doing the rounds, but yeah, synthetic drugs, he said, is such a big issue at the minute. And he said the crazy triangle, they call it, alcohol, benzos, and opiates, seem to be such a big problem when, and I know Anne and the others have talked about the poly drug use problem. So yeah, that's still prevalent, still used. Cocaine's on the increase, and again, the officer was saying the same thing, where they're seeing more and more young people using it at the minute, and we've noticed that in our services. We've had, because of the lockdown, these young people have been living with their family members, and the parents have noticed, and they're phoning in for support for the young person and for themselves as well. That's been something new that we've noticed. So yeah, and we've had so many contacting us for support. So yeah, still there. But our service delivery, like I said, has changed because of COVID. And we are often asking the question, before we, when we start looking at referral and we start looking at a young person and asking the question, why do young people use? That is one of the most prevalent question, So sorry, I completely forgot about the slides. As you can see, I won't dip into every single item on the slides. It's self-explanatory. I'm trying to do two things here, notes and slides, so bear with me. So there you are, alcohol still very high, and THC and vapes have increased, like Fiona was saying. Another trend, again, this officer was saying, is, they're receiving deliveries in the post, and we can't catch these dealers. And it has been on the increase during COVID, especially. So the next slide, like I was saying, when we're often, asking the question, why do young people use, and the one word that I often come back to is pain. They're using because there's some sort of an emotional pain, physical pain, and a psychological pain. Yellamaty very famously said, the question is not why addiction, but ask why the pain, and that's what we're trying to figure out. And that's what we noticed in our services, that these young people who come to us have had, traumatic experiences. And I won't go into detail. Stephanie will step in there, but I know a lot of trauma services at the minute are looking into neglect and abandonment and the impact that has. So we see a lot of young people coming in with very complex needs, very complicated life situations. Building trust seems to be very, very key and very important, and rightly so. They make us work hard for it. I remember as a young person, and I went through trauma, I didn't trust anybody, and I get it, and it's a privilege that they let us in, and they make us work hard to gain their trust. And we noticed that extremely high in the LGBTQ community. I remember working with a young person who had a history of, suicidal behavior, very actively self-harming. There was so much guilt, so much pain, because she wasn't accepted in her home for simply being herself. And it was so abusive for her, the things that she was hearing, in so many different places. I've often wondered, there are services, we're trying to, work with them, get this message across. Until I met a lady at Queen's, who was an activist, but also a tutor, who said, trust. They don't trust services because it has been so hard for them for so long to trust and come out and, seek help. So yeah, trust seems to be a big thing in young people's services. But then again, I worked with another young guy who was gay and comes from a very happy home, and was able to work with him, and he was using small amount of drugs recreationally, and he wanted to cut it down, and he was able to. So yeah, just a bit of background. So impact of substance use on mental health. I know Anne touched on the word dual diagnosis. I've studied dual diagnosis, and as I find that very interesting. When I go into my therapeutic work, I'm always trying to find, again, like she was saying, and I know others have said, a lot of young people who are presented to our services have problematic substance use, but have a mental health illness, and they're dealing with so much that's going on. But yes, it's a personal interest, like I said, trying to figure out why they're using, what they're using, and what need is that particular drug meeting, in their life. What are they getting out of it? And a lot of times we find that they're self-medicating. It's self-soothing, and that's their goal. But what they don't realize is the drug that they're using to relieve them of those symptoms is actually making those symptoms worse. For example, anxiety. Using a drug leads to more anxiety, more social anxiety, isolation, and leading to unemployment, relationship breakdown. It has a knock-on effect. It's trying to get that message across that, look, yes, you're dealing with both, and you're trying to self-medicate, but it doesn't go further, and it's going to be detrimental. And a lot of them do benefit from drug education and harm reduction tools. Like should have mentioned sooner that our focus is harm reduction, and that's the approach we take. And we notice that, when you get that message across that we are here to protect and keep you safe, that's the only aim, and they kind of, buy into the service easily. So anyway, impact on behaviors, as most of you know, when young people use drugs, they're taking more risks, and taking unnecessary risks. Like I said, this young person I was working with who took a whole lot of drugs and fell out of a window, second-story window, and thankfully recovered and was able to get better. but another one who did this exactly similar thing, but had to go on to, strong painkillers after, which led to a different kind of dependency. So we see that so often in our service. Overdoses is another common thing we notice. So yeah, and then there are other things that young people seem to do when they're drunk. Get into fights, violence, and say things that they don't. Family relationships are affected. Again, so many knock-on effects. Again, has an impact on relationships, like I was mentioning, family breakdown, and then there's the big debt problem, and yeah, there's no communication, and they're not part of the community, and yeah, knock-on effects. So try to keep it brief. So the support we offer is one-to-one support, and I'll try and jump pre-COVID and post-COVID, because again, we've had to change so much of our approach post-COVID. It has always been a client-led service. We work with them. We make sure that they are comfortable with what we are trying to do here. And a lot of times they support that. We were able to meet earlier on, but over COVID, we've had to offer phone services, phone calls, Zoom, and yes, and walk and talk at a later stage. And now we're back to seeing them face to face, but again, hybrid and a blended approach. And I know a lot of people are talking other bits and pieces, but I'll just speak a little bit about what's been my experience. We've worked with university students. I know I don't know if you're familiar with this big article in the Sunday Times about how it has increased, and recreationally, of course, and among university students. I get that, this hasn't worked for some, over not being able to meet face to face, but we've seen that it also has worked with a different group of people. It has worked for some, it hasn't worked for some. For example, I was working with this young guy who just before COVID lockdown actually had hurt his head, doesn't remember, had huge amounts of alcohol, hurt his head on the pavement, was rushed to A&E, and he wasn't sure what was going on. And then, he was told after, that this is what happened. And he wanted to really make changes in his life, and then lockdown. And it was such a big deal for him, not being able to meet friends, not being able to be out. But then he used that time to make changes to his drug habit and alcohol use. And for some reason, not having access, not being able to drink with friends, actually was able to reduce his use. And when things did open, he put all those harm reduction techniques in practice. And he said, it's actually worked for me. Before COVID, we also offered group work to a lot of young ones. I've noticed, I know Fiona has mentioned this before, that, younger ones don't take up, support. And again, my experience has been, it's because they like the newfound freedom, they're early teens, and they really like what they're using. So group work seemed to be very popular with them, and it was very, it started off, them sharing knowledge, but also we were able to come in and offer education and say, look, this is what's happening when you're using drugs. So that really worked well. Also worked in hostels for a little while, and again, group work seemed to do much better in hostels. Notice that they come from such, again, complex backgrounds and a lot of trauma, and they were able to come to sessions. Yes, they like to talk, but sometimes they wouldn't, and they just share funny stories. I remember there was one story of this young guy who was very proud of stealing a police car over the weekend. And yeah, so it gave us a chance to talk and share yeah, from our side, we were able to give, education, drug education, but they were able to bring their own stories. So group work has a lot of benefits, we've noticed. And Simon Community actually offered a pizza after. So we were able to do life after the life over pizza, as we called it. It was great. It was a great pilot. We should go back to that more after, maybe when things get to normal. I was recently speaking to a Simon community worker who was sharing how, yes, they come from, there's a lot of trauma in their life, but it doesn't kind of end there. For young people who are living in hostels, one of the things she noticed, she said that really, struck a chord was when they have children, their children are taken away because of their complex lives, substance use and mental health. There's so much going on with them. And that actually added to their substance use. And she's herself said that, yeah, prescription use is highly prevalent in among hostels. We also offer family support, therapeutic systemic family support. I know Fiona touched because family work is so important in this line of work. Again, a lot of trauma that happens, in childhood, and when you start working with them, a lot of it is unraveled, and family support is very important. And I leave that bit to Stephanie. She's going to expand a bit more. Partnership work, very important. It's good to work with other people. We're always working with social services, youth justice, probation, different services. And if it's for different reasons. If they don't answer my phone call, they'll always answer a probation officer's phone call. So it's always good to work in conjunction with somebody. So yeah, and it also protects us, but it also gives extra support for the young person. So we always make sure that partnership work is crucial, and it starts at the very beginning of the therapeutic work. There was a recent pilot that ASCERT had done with the police service, which is called I don't know why they call it the Community Resolution Notice. It is it's a drug education program, again, for young offenders with minor offenses. So it's these young guys or young people who are caught with minor offenses, instead of putting them through the judicial system, are sent to this. And I was asking this PSNI officer, have you seen benefits? How do you know it's benefited them? No. And he said, drug education seems to be very, very key for these young people, and that seems to work. The harmful effects, because a lot of times they just take for the sake of taking, and without knowing the harmful effects. So that's my bit done. There are lots of positive stories also, but I know I don't have much time. You can come back to me and ask me, but this is what we try to do. We try to get alongside. We try to listen, provide a safe space for them to feel, that they're heard. I always use Maya Angelou's quote. I'm sure you're aware of this one. People will forget what you've said, people will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And that's what we try to do in our services, because of, what they go through outside. When they come to us, we try to give them that safe space and say, look, we understand what you're going through. We're here to help you. We're on your side. So that is my bit done. Over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Preeti. Good morning, everybody. And as a service provider, it's great to have the opportunity to be here this morning. I'm going to speak from a counsellor's perspective on providing the service for the young people and the impact that ACE, adverse childhood experiences, have on substance use in the long term too. There's no question that what happens to you as a child impacts the rest of your life, whether that be positive or negative. And children who are exposed to things like physical, sexual, emotional abuse, witnessing mental or physical abuse at home, the list on the screen, when they're exposed to those, these ACEs cause lifelong stress and pain and suffering. And I suppose just on that, you know, the adverse community environment, you know, with living in particularly significant living in Northern Ireland, you know, in terms of an environment of conflict, you know, in the transgenerational trauma, you know, and the legacy of the Troubles, you know, that these will impact on the young people, you know, growing up. And what we are finding when we're starting the therapeutic intervention is the prevalence of trauma and substance use or problematic substance use is a symptom of something underlying. And these young people, they're struggling with the ACEs, so they're using substances, as Preeti has already sort of touched on, to numb and soothe the pain, to help them cope and to help with the intrusive thoughts and make sense of the trauma and, you know, the life and the difficulties they're experiencing. I suppose rather than it being acts of criminality, it just represents form of risk-taking behaviour that is considered, I suppose, a normative response to trauma. So, I mean, the criminality that comes with the substance, you have problematic substance use, you know, the stealing, the maybe been pulled into dealing in substances themselves. It is often, I suppose, a normative response to what they're feeling themselves in regards to the trauma that they have lived. And this is particularly heightened with the young people, you know, with additional complexities, you know, the likes of the looked after children, CSE, the child sexual exploitation. There's all additional, I suppose, all additional needs to consider. It's worth noting that not all young people who have experienced adversity go on to misuse substances either. And also not all young people who misuse substances have experienced trauma. So it's just, I suppose I wanted to point that out. But several studies have found that the more ACEs, the more adverse childhood experiences that a young person is exposed to, the more likely it is that they will begin to use substances at an earlier age. And as has been already noted, the age that we would find them coming into our services using is, I suppose, around 15, 16 years old. Do you want to move on to the next slide, Preeti, please? It's important to have a trauma-informed approach in respect of substance use or problematic substance use, as it considers the impact the trauma has had on the young person. And very, very, like Preeti has already sort of said in regards to Yellamaty, it's not what's wrong with you. It's, you know, that's not the question that needs to be asked. It's what's happened to you. And it's sitting with that young person, you know, in that space and having that relationship with the young person and allowing them to work through their trauma and to work towards, rather than maladaptive coping strategies, more healthier ways of coping and dealing with problems and adversities in life. And problematic substance use, it needs to be addressed in a holistic manner. You know, they can't, in my experience or in the experience of the service, they don't, when it becomes a problematic thing, they don't often exist isolated. They coexist together, the trauma and the problematic substance misuse. And the role of the counsellor in this is to establish that trust and relationship where the young person feels safe. And it's only through relational trauma can only be healed through relationships. And by having that trust and relationship with the young person will allow them to grow, to develop and to heal. And it's not about revisiting the trauma or going over the traumatic experience, but it's about listening and validating, and that's key to their healing journey. The assessment, we incorporate ACE, you know, from an ACE informed perspective. So we would ask the young people, you know, what's the motivation for using the substance, and they'd maybe come back and they'd say, you know, well, it's escapism. And that gives you, you know, that opens it, escaping from what, and that opens it up, that you're asking about past traumas, you know, previous experiences. You know, a lot of the young people say it's to block block out feelings, to block out racing thoughts, and it's that combined questioning with how their family life is, and their physical and mental health, or how it is for school and work, that it gives that overall, I suppose, that holistic view of the young person, and an insight into what they've been through and why they're using substance as a way of coping. I'm going to move on just to a case study. I suppose I wanted to use a case study to make it just relatable then, that I suppose demonstrate how the talking therapies work for the young people with, who initially present with problematic substance misuse. This young person has given consent for the case study to be discussed. Obviously, all identifying details have been changed to protect anonymity and confidentiality, and we'll refer to the young person as John. So John has been in and out of the service a few times. In his, he was 15, I think, when he first started into the service. He came out again, and he came back in about 18. This is the first time that John has actually self-referred. He's 23 years old, and he is self-referred into the service. He's recently been released from custody. And prior to being in custody, he misused. It was more so prescription drugs before he went into custody. But since been released, he would say that he uses alcohol, and it's only alcohol at the moment that he's using. He wants to come off all substances and wants to see a life outside of, and be able to grow and develop outside of relying on substances. And just a bit of background on John. John lives with his parents. He has no siblings. The relationship with his parents is currently strained, and he would report an assessment. He would report a history of bullying at age 11. He also lost his grandmother when he was 12 years old, and he talks very affectionately about his grandmother. His grandmother would appear to be a very significant figure in his life. He ended education himself when he was about 17. He dropped out. He went on to tech and he dropped out. So he's currently unemployed. He has a 2-year-old son who is current to social services at the time of the assessment. And John has supervised contact with his son. Now, John's level of motivation was assessed as moderate to high when he came in. And he would say since his release from custody, he feels elements of shame, and his anxiety has went up, more so social anxiety, and he doesn't want to be going outside and socialising because he's anxious of getting himself into situations where substances would be available, and he would go back down that route again. And it's something that John has been very clear that he doesn't want to do. He would say that drugs and alcohol in the past made him feel confident and fun, and he got a sense of acceptance with his peer group. So I suppose on to the counselling process with that information. It was about building that therapeutic trust and relationship with John, and it's taking in the core conditions, that non-judgmental attitude, the acceptance, the unconditional acceptance, the congruence, and it very much client-led, very much led by John. So it was providing an environment where John was autonomous in his directions in life. When he first came in, when he first started therapy, John, he had a very, I suppose, fixated on deprivation of self. He was, I couldn't do that. I've got, nobody give me a chance. Sure, I'm only a druggie, and he was very, very negative self-talk about himself. So we worked on building his self-worth, and doing some exercises around that, and focusing on what his positive attributes were, and encouraged him to notice compliments that he had received, and what he had achieved in life. His anxiety at the start was quite high as well, and we did work around that also. There was one session he came in, he was very sort of animated and agitated at the time, and when we sort of explored it, he felt a lack of trust from his mother, and he couldn't, he described it as being mentally imprisoned, and admitted that his alcohol use had went up that week because he felt it was to block out feelings of inadequacy that he felt, because his mother, he felt his mother had been on his case, he talked about, you know, and that she didn't trust him, and that he just felt that there was no way of going forward. So his alcohol use sort of went up that week, and he would say that it was to deal with those, you know, to help him cope. So we looked at, you know, his decision and a decision and balance sheet, and we sort of put, like, you know, what was the positive, the losses and the gains of continued substance use for him. And it, you know, it allowed him to look at himself then, you know, what was beneficial for himself, and he took full control of that then. The next few sessions, it was quite evident that John found it uncomfortable, which is not uncommon with young people, but he found it the one-to-one, face-to-face uncomfortable, and we brought in elements of creative therapy. You know, we used a timeline as a, you know, to, I suppose, it was like a visual synopsis of his life. We rolled out a large, it was a wallpaper, and rolled it out on the floor, and John sat down and he drew out, you know, positives in his life, negatives in his life, and, you know, and through that was a fantastic exercise, because it got John sort of thinking, and he became quite angry during that session. Well, you know, emotional, I suppose would be more a better word, during the session. And he sort of relayed that his mum and dad worked a lot when he was younger, so he felt that, you know, I suppose it was clear from then that his basic needs weren't being met, and this is why his grandmother had become such a significant figure in his life. He went on to talk about how his dad, when he did have alcohol, that his dad became very, very aggressive, and he had witnessed on several occasions, you know, domestic abuse within the home. He talked about how he had been silenced, that, you know, that he held, it was evident that there was like deep-seated anger in him, and he talked about how he felt silenced with it, and he had held this in him all this time, and he had used alcohol and drugs because it made him forget about those things. So we worked on that anger and sort of worked him through it, and, you know, it was suggested unsent letter writing, that feelings of hurt and the feelings of anger that he had held for so many years, that he put these into letters, and that he could almost express how he was feeling without telling the people themselves, but he could release himself from that. And John found this extremely therapeutic and, you know, really cathartic, and it brought up a lot of stuff for him. You know, so it was a really good piece of work done around that. In the subsequent sessions, he presented so much more at ease, and he was so much more goal focused. Now, his alcohol use went up and down, but he was starting to go for weekends without any alcohol at all. He was getting more time with his son, and it was only during the week. And when we explored that, it was through boredom, he said, that, you know, he was using during the week. So we explored, you know, what's his previous interests and what did he like doing. And he talked about, one of his nice memories was his father was going fishing with him, and we had encouraged him, you know, I wonder would that be an option again. And he did. He came in the following week, and he had been fishing with his father for the first time in years. He started to reconnect with old peer groups, so he started to get out and about. Towards the end of counselling, and the outcome of it all was that John's confidence just flourished. He was a different person from he came in till he came out. His alcohol use had, when there was a final review done, you know, a 6-month final review, he hadn't drank in 4 weeks because he didn't feel the need to. He had secured a part-time job, and he had been getting more contact with his son. I suppose in terms of the family, the relationship with his mum and dad had improved. He said the communication in the house, he felt himself that he had a voice, and he became more assertive within the house, which was to his benefit and to everyone's benefit. So the family unit benefited from John attending therapy, and John's overall physical health improved, and his mental health improved. He still had bouts of anxiety, but he was aware of the triggers, and he knew how to implement the tools that he had, you know, picked up throughout therapy, and manage the anxiety. I suppose just before he, as he left, he left feedback for the service. And what he said was, it wasn't like any other place I've been to. I didn't feel that you looked down on me or judged me. You understood me and helped me understand myself. I looked forward to sessions. They were easy and relaxed, and I could talk about anything that was on my mind and always felt better afterwards. Thanks for not judging me. And I think that's the key with substance or problematic substance use or anything. It's not to judge and to accept that person and to understand that there's something possibly going on behind it. There's always a story behind it. And I'll pass back to Fiona just to conclude.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. I think that was a really clear reflection of how transformative the work can be within our services. And it's really important to hear those kind of really positive stories as well, because we do have loads of them. We want to promote that. And for all the struggles that young people present with, they can make changes that are really positive for themselves. So that's brilliant. I just want to do a quick roundup of just some of the thoughts that we've been discussing. These discussion points have been around for a while. Some of them are new, some of them they're ever evolving in terms of what we feel young people need going forward. There's an ongoing issue around residential support for young people and providing those services. And we know that's in the context of a wider mental health issue around residential support for young people who've got comorbidity, dual diagnosis issues, taken in different issues, even everything from eating disorders right through to, quite challenging dual diagnosis issues. So we're not sure where that's on the agenda, but we want, obviously, drug and alcohol to be front and centre in relation to mental health with young people. So again, that comes into then my next point, which is bridging the gap between young people and adult services. Our services do that with 11 to 25-year-olds. And I suppose we were promoting that works, that flexibility and that kind of service works for that age group. And really, could that be reflected in other statutory services, other voluntary services as well? We're looking at youth services, they may be 18 plus, go into adult services, but really they should be maybe looking at that youth. If we look at the NICI report of 2018, which is still waiting, it's a third report about mental health services for young people. It's a long read, but it's reflective of really how people are feeling in relation to young people within this system, and drugs and alcohol. We all participated in that research, so it's a really good read. Promoting the rights of substance use, again, as I said, with child and adolescent mental health services within all sectors. Investment in the workforce, which again is discussed in the background. Really, what do we need to do this job and to equip ourselves and to support people? I would say people who work in drug and alcohol world in this region are really good at educating themselves, sharing knowledge, all that kind of thing. But it's and providing that training as well, but it's just keeping on top of what's happening and stuff. So, and everybody has a part to play in that. The early intervention and prevention within schools and communities. So it's really looking at how we can promote that with, kind of champions and harm reduction environments. And back to what Preeti was saying, was promoting that harm reduction approach. We know that works. We know young people need to have services that reflect that, choice and readiness, reducing their use, pragmatic approaches along with the therapeutic approaches and within the family system. So, but that's also about schools and communities too. And schools are challenging environments to say, look, young people are using substances. What are we going to come and have a conversation about it? Depending on the school and the environment and the culture, that's an ongoing challenge. I love a chat about that within schools. So hidden harm and family support, partnerships, further development. Again, we're in discussions about that. We know many young people are who have used substances and going to develop transgenerational problematic use. The hidden harm. For those of you who don't know what hidden harm is, it's really about supporting young people who live in environments, are being cared for in environments where people use substances, siblings or carers or parents. So again, it's about bridging that gap and how can we integrate those services as well, and looking at that family structure. Looked after young people. So specialist services are really looked after environments. Strategy services are looking at substance use strategies for these young people. We're involved at the moment with the South Eastern Trust around looking at that, and also then how that develops into adult services as well. So I mean, Gary might touch on it here, but we're looking at a Complex Lives Partnership Alliance within the Belfast City Council to look at those young people and those adults who are come with complex lives, are ruthless and homeless, or injecting opiate injectors, street drinkers, all those really, really complex lives. So we're looking at that too. There's an ongoing issue about overdose prevention centres within the city centres as well. All those really, really, really kind of baseline important harm reduction approaches. And young people are in the middle of that and are there and need supported. And obviously we need to look at gender specific services too. So they're just some thoughts. I mean, it's endless list of what we could do for young people in terms of the future, but needless to say, we are working hard in the background and chipping away at what we can do every day for young people. And we are engaging them as well in terms of what they feel they need to. So we're busy, we're very positive, and hopefully we can have an impact on the future lives of young people in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, and Preeti and Stephanie. That's a very insightful and compelling presentation. I think there's a really good kind of insight of what's going on in the within services, engaging with young people, but also a lot of the, I think you hit on a lot of kind of key issues that are challenges for us in terms of how we move forward. Okay, thank you. We're just running about 5 minutes late, but that's all grand. We're going to take a 10-minute comfort break. So if just we'll just switch off the camera here for 10 minutes to give people a comfort break, and we'll pick things up again with our next presentation at 11:10. Okay, so see you all in 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to kick off again with our last speaker before we move into the question and answer for the remaining of the session. And before I introduce Eilish, just to remind everybody that the question and answer tab, feel welcome to put in any questions that you have now that you would want us to kind of to consider whenever we're doing the panel question and answer. And you can go in and you can look at other people's questions and like them if there's something you also feel that you want us to ask, and they'll be promoted so we can see the ones that get the most kind of interest from the people attending. So I want to welcome Dr. Eilish Gilvarry, who is the Clinical Director of Specialties and Forensic Services at Northumberland, Tyne, and we are NHS Foundation Trust. She's also a consultant psychiatrist in addictions at Newcastle Addiction Service, an honorary professor of addiction psychiatry at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. So we're very pleased to have her here to be able to share her thoughts with us on this subject. So I'll just hand over to you, Eilish, just to make it.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have about 40 minutes, is that right?
Yes.
Or in and around. Will you give me, I watch my time, so that's about 5 to 12 to finish.
Sure.
I just watch my time. I have a lot of slides, and I'm going to my talk is about a little bit on prevalence and more highlighting a few things rather than giving you everything. A bit on what the evidence is, but I will more concentrate on the treatment end. A little bit on principles and what services around and what are the issues and etc. I think having listened to some of the talks just before me, I think what I'm going to say will resonate with what a lot of you have already said. I've been involved with young people in addiction services for many years, and I'll tell you what we did and then how we lost it all and what all the problems are. But let me tell you, first of all, adolescents and young people are different to adults, and I think there is a merging and a blurring of that, and I think we need to be very clear. But adolescence is the peak age for initiation of substance use. It's also a very broad dynamic group. So adolescence, young person, child is very different, and it spans from school age up to young adults. So, and the terminology varies across from adolescents to teenagers to young adults to children to young people. So we have to be clear. The responses differ substantially though, and it will differ on the age and stage of life and the level of use and the context of use. But we also need to be aware why services and responses need to be different is we're dealing with very different people, if you like. They're children and growing with development during puberty, but physiological, cognitive, risk-taking and emotional changes. They're also making milestones that will be there forever, which is ending school, transition to careers, move to independence, and all at different ages and stages. And the focus of responses should rightly be so much more preventative and early intervention. But then we're using different settings and platforms. And with COVID, there's a lot more on digital, and some people are much better on digital discussions. However, what we don't know is how good are the digital brief interventions, etc., because we don't have a great amount of research for it in young people. We're beginning to, but it's not great. So let me just bring you through a few slides on prevalence, but there's too many, and I'm happy if you want to share my slides, but I just want to take you through a few things that I think are important in some of the slides. First of all, youth. And again, when you look at the states, they talk about youth, they talk about teenage, they talk about school graders. So, and they talk about college students, all at different ages. So we need to be careful when we're looking at prevalence. But what they're saying is youth drug abuse, high profile public health concern. 1 in 8 teenagers have used an illicit drug in the last year. That's sort of telling you where the prevalence is, even though everyone is saying now alcohol and drug use has been reduced significantly, especially in the UK, but it's beginning to increase again. But, you know, 43% of college students use illicit drugs. 86% of teenagers know somebody. So smoking, using drugs, drinking is still very much part of the school day. One of the most important points is that early drug abuse correlates with substance use problems in later life. So the most significant of that is increase in problematic behavior. And I think somebody talked about some years ago, there was a discussion of 2 different people or 2 different types of groups. I think it's a spectrum, it's not 2 different types. But one is the kid who misuses drugs, who recreationally uses or might even die from alcohol poisoning, but they're getting on with their lives. But the other is the person who has multiple vulnerabilities prior to their drug use. And that's a different group. I don't think they're separate, but I think it's a spectrum and we need to be aware of that. But one of the most important things is of the overdose deaths in the States, 11% are 15 to 24-year-olds. So again, these children, young people die. If we're talking about alcohol in the States, far the most commonly abused substance among teens and young adults. Again, be careful of the terminology in young adults because you can't go to the pub until you're 21 in the States and they all differ. But 60% report binge drinking. And again, it's something similar to what we have. You don't have much dependence. You do have a number with alcohol use disorder, but that's more abuse rather than dependence. And it's more binge drinking and increasing. Now, youth drug use in the States tends to predict adult use, and that's what we all know, and we need to be careful. But a few of us, and very often, and when we look at the Dame Carol Black, which I'll mention later, she did a report on young people here, well, on all addictions, but partly young people. We're all talking about illicit drugs, but 3% talk about misusing pain relievers. And many of those who go on to heroin, a lot of them have started with prescribed drugs. Now that's very much in the States, but it is also becoming here. So we must be careful about prescribed drugs and misuse of prescribed drugs, not just illicit drugs. Now, they're talking about the opioid use disorder here in the States, or not here in the States, in the States, national public health emergency, overdose deaths increasing 500%. Our overdose, Scotland is the highest in Europe, and Northeast here in Newcastle is very high for related drugs, for related deaths, mostly in 30, 40-year-olds, but beginning to creep up in the younger age, the drug-related deaths. So again, be careful. The third and fourth point there is high school students who legitimately use prescription opioids are a third more likely to misuse opiates after high school. So again, high risk. If we're talking about high risk and prevention, be careful of those who are using prescribed opiates for legitimate reasons. And 5% of the 12th graders have abused opioids other than heroin and left one. So, and you can see some of them are abusing OxyContin and Vicodin, and I'm sure it's the same in Belfast, it is here too. So let me quickly talk about England. And this is the surveys that have been done. 3% of 11 to 15-year-olds reported Class A drugs in 18, about the same in 2016, but it's slightly changing. Years ago, it was very much opioids. It's much more cocaine now. And the trend among young adults, remember most of them, the drug service in England now, and young people are up to 24, which I will talk about later. And that's similar to the thing, but there was a large decrease initially, high use, then decrease, and now increasing again. And that's pretty much for all drugs. It was high, reducing, and now beginning to move again. And that's the same with cocaine. And the reverse is because of cocaine powder in young people. So again, data to end of March 2020 that was published by ONS. 1 in 5 adults 16 to 24, you can see they're called adults now, age 16 to 24, have taken a drug in the last year. 7% have used Class A drugs in the last year. Not significantly different. Ecstasy up a little bit, no change, but it was lower than what it was, but it's now beginning to move again. The other ones that are beginning to move is MPS was very high in about 2016 and whatever. And with the change of the ACMD report and whatever, it has begun to reduce again. And it is much more new psychoactives in those with multiple drug use, though nitrous oxide is significantly increasing here in the UK. Now, whether that's just the context of its use, but in the last year, 2.5% of 16 to 29 were using, but 8% of 16 to 24-year-olds. So it's very much relevant to the young people. The use of amphetamine had gone down, but beginning to shift again. Ketamine also increased. Don't know why, but it's increasing among young adults. In my young people service, we do see a certain amount of ketamine. I've had 2 where they've had chemical cystitis, which is the most common, not the most common, but a most dangerous side effect requiring bladder surgery. So that is the most important thing to tell your young people. And a lot were seen as prevalence. So again, you can see the slide here, beginning to go down and then beginning to go up. And that's really what's happening in drug misuse. 11 to 15-year-olds. You've seen the SPAD report. It's on 16-year-olds. England didn't take part in the last one, while the UK didn't. But again, it's showing you that there's a huge variability across Europe. Alcohol, easy availability. Cannabis was the most obtainable drug in terms of illicit drugs. High lifetime prevalence, particularly in boys. But 1 to 2% of students, and these are 16-year-olds now in school, use an illicit drug other than cannabis at least once. But there was a huge variation. You'll see the report on the CDDA. There's a huge variation between different countries. This is back to England again, England and Wales. You can see the decrease and then beginning to increase again among Class A drugs, but it's mainly cocaine where it used to be opioids. Now, very much fitting with what the last speakers have been saying, is these are treatment people in UK, and I just wanted, these are those attending the specific drug and alcohol treatment young people. And young people are up to 24, but some of them are reporting up to 18. So it depends on the report. But there was a reduction in the previous year, and a very significant reduction in the people in treatment in the last 10 years. Now, people are wondering, was that simply a reduction in drug use and therefore you didn't need the services, or was that a contraction of drug services due to austerity and actually they didn't come forward? My feel would be the latter. Cannabis is still the most common in terms of presenting. 4 in 10 are saying they have problems with alcohol, and quite a number with ecstasy and powder cocaine. Slight decrease, but it's very small on those coming for heroin, and significant reduction in those saying problems with benzodiazepines. Even though in Scotland and here now, in terms of adults, we're seeing a very significant rise in use of benzodiazepines, illicit benzos, and some of them, when they're saying they're illicit benzos, when the police have checked it or toxicology have checked it, it's not benzos. So we need to be careful what we're using. But vulnerabilities, and this is fitting with you, early onset of substance use, huge vulnerability, 76%, and that's starting before 15, which is already a risk factor. And then there's polydrugs. I rarely see a person now using one drug. It's all polydrug use, including alcohol. Girls more vulnerability than boys, mostly health, self-harming and sexual exploitation, which kind of fits. Those that, and I think it's more than a third of young people who started treatment in this year said they had a mental health treatment need. I think it depends what you define as mental health. It was higher than the last year, more girls reporting than boys. But it does say that those who had a mental health treatment received help from some form of treatment, usually from a community mental health team. I'm not sure I believe that stat in terms of my experience. Other vulnerabilities was boys, particularly antisocial, more common in boys. Domestic abuse, fitting in with the hidden harm of parental abuse. Other substance abuse, which fits in with parental abuse. And then there was the range of very few actually pregnant, very few with housing problems, very few injecting. But you can see there's a huge range of, which fits with what my point is going to be. Okay, let me briefly talk about the evidence base. Now, I am more, before people say, what's the evidence base for prevention? I'm going to direct you to 1 or 2 really good papers and say something more about treatment services. But this and the next slide is a lovely, lovely paper in Lancet Psychiatry. I give the reference in the next slide, which sort of talks to you about the universal prevention and then the early intervention, what that might be, and then the treatment services. It's very American style, but it was a review that was done by Emily Stocking and Louise Degenhart from New South Wales on the evidence internationally on young people. And they're looked at, and there's a reference, and I will just give you a few things at the end, but do please read it. It's only up to 2016, but it's probably the best reference I have seen that reviews the whole responses to use, abuse, and dependence in young people, and they're meaning up to 18. And they look at it from a population and individual point of view, and of course, looking at the evidence for age, driving, sales restrictions, tax minimum unit price. That's where the evidence is, you know, delaying it, huge. Fairly iffy on education and prevention in terms of mass media campaigns and educational settings. Some of it very much, if you get parental involvement and much more solution focused and much more looking at the whole lifestyle. And then they talk about harm reduction as giving needle syringe exchanges and whatever, but not a lot of evidence for the under 18s, and then treatment. I'll give you a few examples in a moment, but that is an excellent article. So if you look at the psychosocial interventions, the evidence base for under 18 is very limited. Most of the evidence is taken from adult or youth literature. Across all of the psychosocial interventions, any of the meta-analysis will say there is a positive efficacy on active treatment, but there's little difference between the treatments. And if you look at the cannabis youth trial that was done by Dennis, they had various forms of therapy, from motivational interviewing to CBT and whatever. None of them came out dramatically different, but they all did well. And what they talk about is interventions is an overlapping phases of assessment, engagement, treatment, dropout, and there's common factors, which is what you've all been talking about today. Very much a therapeutic alliance of empathy, warmth. But what's most important is fostering expectations for improvement. That is being seen as hugely important in your, and many of you will know that those not working in substance misuse often have a, well, nothing works, does it? And they often have that negative expectation for improvement. So you should be fostering it. Motivational enhancement therapies, there is general consensus on positive outcomes, but it's mostly from adult populations. CBT, the clinical guidelines for NICE have suggested to offer it for those with limited comorbidities. That's not significant risks and good social support, and it is effective. Group work with CBT can be effective, but be careful of group composition. Some would say those with antisocial behavior, put them all together, particularly the criminal justice system. It can work, but you have to be a very good therapist to manage it carefully, and that it isn't just a good networking for drug use. And there's a lot of evidence about skills training in educational settings, and there's two very nice documents there from NICE that are worth reading on that. Family therapies get a huge push, and I have to say I'm a huge believer in family involvement. I'm not sure structured family therapy as it's done in the States, manual based or whatever, has enough evidence. And it's, I would say, the family therapies, which is family support comprising information, engagement, improving parenting skills, understanding of children's needs, and indeed helping the parents to support the independence and that gradual development of children, is hugely important. Systemic reviews, and there's a nice review by Markham in 2018 of structured family therapies like the multisystemic or the multidimensional family therapies, conflicting, inconsistent evidence, because they're seeing it as a standalone, very structured treatment, and there's minimal of it in the States and in UK. And what they're saying is the degree of heterogeneity in young people and families are so difficult to know what are the specific aspects of family therapy that actually work. But what they're saying is it should not be used as a standalone therapy, but within a multi-component package of care. So multi-component packages are managing your drug use, managing your depression or your anxiety or self-harm, managing social supports, and that multi-component package of care is what's needed. So let me briefly talk about treatment and interventions. I don't know, this was I still stands the test of time, this one. It's 2012, it's, if you just Google it, it's on any website. And we did it with the College of Psychiatry, College of Practitioners, General Practitioners, Alcohol Concern, Drug Scope, Mind, Children, etc. Family and parents were involved in it. And we talked about the practice standards. It is worth reading because some of them still worth test of time. I'm going to skip that slide. A few things. One, we said brief assessment, identification. Now, there is some difficulties here about brief intervention in young people. Most are saying all young people thought to be at risk, which is quite a lot of people, should be identified wherever and briefly assessed for substance use, but they should be assessed for lifestyle change, obesity, smoking, drug use, everything. It shouldn't just be for drug use. And trained staff should consider their needs. And if you're asking questions, of course, they should be fit for purpose. But some are saying, and NICE said, there's no evidence for brief interventions under 15. And that Jim McCambridge in 2008, you can see how little evidence there is. looked at brief intervention in over 15 and said you should do it. Now, in a big study I was involved with those attending A&E for alcohol problems, we didn't find that brief intervention was effective. And we felt that if they were already attending A&E for an alcohol issue, you should be going straight into comprehensive assessment and much more, rather than a brief intervention as an adult model. I think the most important thing is a comprehensive assessment, but it doesn't have to be done all in one day. It can be done over 6 months or whatever. And I can never pronounce the second name, but it's Perpi, whatever. She does a lovely paper, if you Google her, on a comprehensive assessment, and it's referred in the practice guidelines of having all the templates that you need. But the whole thing is about addressing consent. But what I'm saying about young people and parents is some people say, once they're over 16, they've given consent, they're Gaelic competent, that's fine. Or over 18, you don't even bother with parents. I think it should be proactive involvement of parents with every person. And that is in the spirit of the Children Act. And it shouldn't just be, you cut the box for legal cover and that's it. You should be actively involving the parents, because trying to help the parents separate and help the child grow and develop is so much important for the child. So involvement of parents is crucial. But as you all know, you have to look, substance use is only one issue. You have to look at developmental education, physical health, you all know that, and it's a multi-team. And these are just some of the treatments again, but what we don't know is we don't know what is length of treatment. We have no idea how long somebody should be in treatment. We're not sure what is the best settings. Most settings are outpatients or drop-in centres with third sector or wherever you do. There's very little intensive daycare. We don't know if court orders or voluntary helps very much. We don't know, because we have very few rehabilitation units under 18. We don't know whether therapeutic communities work, and there's just little bit, so we need to be careful. But part of the barrier to treating is it's often unrecognized, it's often undetected, even if it's, but we don't know what is the clarity of the model to be used, and we don't know what is really best practice. We're unclear about age-appropriate environment, because we talk about young people under 18, and then the drug services here, public health, whatever, have talked about up to 24 youth services. I'm absolutely for developing youth service, but a 23-year-old opiate heroin user is a very different person to a 15-year-old drug user. And to conflate the pair all into a youth service, I don't think it's acceptable. So your under 18s, you should be having different engagement issues, different consent issues, parental involvement. Pharmacotherapy, I'm going to skip because of time, but do think it is very important, and it isn't about, do we simply treat with methadone or buprenorphine or not? We're looking at emergency. Do we give naloxone to a 16-year-old who's occasionally using opiates? A question for the panel. I leave it out there, because you can now have nasal. Or do you give it to family? We rarely have to detoxify people under 18, but if we're looking at youth services up to 20, we most certainly do. And how should we do that? Should we be into long-term maintenance for an 18-year-old with opiates? Or do we do what the states do, is before you go into maintenance or before you get methadone, you have to have 2 failed attempts. Now, I think that's punitive to allow somebody to fail twice before you can treat. I think that's all wrong. But then there might be consequences like hepatitis C already, like hepatitis B. Are we vaccinating every child in our services for hepatitis B? That's a prevention. Are we doing it for every child? What about coexisting physical care? If they have, you'll see some who have diabetes, and then there's drug interaction. So when I say pharmacotherapy, don't just go down the road of the methadone. Just think very broad, because if they're treating ADHD, should they be using drugs? How do we manage that? So we'll see a mix of, and that's pretty much what I've just said. Now, I think this is the most important slide, and I cannot find, but I've used this slide for 20 years, the pre-engaged child. That's the person we need to find. The person who's doing everything in treatment services and mum and dad are coming and they're going to school or they're whatever, we've got there, they're moving. That's the easy one. It's the person who just floats in and out of treatment, who arrives and then leaves again, etc. But they're probably known to some agency or person somewhere, be it social services or school or criminal justice or whatever. But we need to have active outreach and engagement for them. And a bit on safeguarding, care and protection has to be huge. But that's where I say, what about specific harm reduction? Are we thinking of physical health care, sexual health, housing? Do we give naloxone to carers? What about BBV, vaccination for Hep B? How do we involve the other services? Because they say, well, they're not engaged. They come twice, they didn't turn up for their appointment and they're discharged. We work with a much more active sort of outreach model, but not other services do that. So how do you work with it? And how do you bring in the mum, the dad, the carer, the aunt, whoever that important person is, often granny? How do you support them to help with the child? But there's the $60 question. A couple of minutes on principles, and then I'm going to say something on services. I'm all right for time. Very interesting document, this one. Have a look on the principles of adolescent substance use in the States. Couple of things which I've already said, and I think probably everyone is going to agree with me, but children and young people, and therefore so services, are different than those for adults. I've always said the child is not an adult, even if they speak and are very verbally able, and that's often harder. When they are so verbally able and very educated, you actually might think they understand, but they might not. And of course, it fits with age and maturity, responsibility, safeguarding. You all know this. But also, staff competencies are different. There's a focus, as I said, on more prevention. And then the platforms for the interventions are unique. But we don't know enough. Like, educational settings are huge, but it's often difficult, and especially with COVID now, to go into educational settings and to find times and where you do it. And then they all find, oh, we have all loads of drugs and alcohol in our school. We don't want you here because that's increasing it. So it's not as easy to use educational settings as you think. Practitioners should be able to assess capacity. Now, my key little bugbear is there's often a form which everyone has to tick the box. Have you given consent for intervention? But if 2 months down the line, you're doing something else in terms of intervention, consent is not a blanket consent. So if you're doing a different intervention, you must get consent, particularly if it's a pharmacological intervention. But just be aware, consent at the start is not a blanket consent. So it depends what you're doing. But you must also be able to understand their developmental needs. And while a few of us who know this talk about it, there's a lot of people who have not worked with young people who are working in the young people domain, particularly in addiction services up to 24, and they don't understand it. But you need to be aware, and some of these points are going to be in the new UK alcohol guidelines, which are about to come out for consultation. And what we're saying is, while we're saying it's up to youth is up to 24, those under 18 should be different in some way, and you need to make sure you are. But it's awareness of the broader landscape of children's services, not adult addiction. Obviously, I've said this, collaborate, integrate with education, and this and other children's services. This should be routine rather than so we don't work as silos in our own counselling services. It should be one integrated, maybe district model working together. Of course, you have to consider the gender differences and mental health particularly. I'm surprised it's only a third, because I think nearly everyone has, if you think broadly on mental health, I think everyone has some mental health with significant drug use. But there's also flexibility of appointments. If mums and dads are working, if they're at school, etc., we should be keeping them at school and trying to see them afterwards. So it's all of the best idea. And be aware you must share information if it's in the best interest of the child, but you must be clear about it. Okay, let me talk for 5-10 minutes. Have I 5-10 minutes on setting up services? This is my bête noire. I wrote a document. Well, but I with others, on the health service advisory document in 2000. And I did it with a number of people in drugs and young people and mental health and whatever. And we had a young person who was actually in the youth government to write the start of it. So we involved youth from the very start. But what I said, and I will still say it should be today, and it isn't happening, is that services for children, and I use the term appropriately, for children and young people, let's say up to 18, but of course we need to be aware of transitions and youth, should be within children's services, with the addition of addiction workers to support the children's services. It shouldn't be addiction services with a bit of support from children, because addiction services were very opiate related driven, were alcohol dependent driven, were adult model, whereas the children's services were everything of the principles we're all talking about. Now, how you do that doesn't really matter, but the issue is all of the children's services have the basic or should have the basic components and skills of understanding developmental issues, safeguarding, education, and we who know something about drug and alcohol use is hugely integral to that. But be careful on our adults. I will still go with it even though it's changed. We had multiple services, things with what was the National Treatment Agency. We wrote the practice parameters in 2012. Myself and Jill Britton wrote guidelines on prescribing in secure units and in the community. We did a bit of research, but not enough. And I tell you now, we won't get any service to change by saying, I think we know how to do this, unless we research it and can prove it. And we didn't do enough research. And everything we did was it should be distinct from adult addiction. So we set it up. What we initially did, and I'll just briefly tell you, is we had a third sector, which was a drop-in up to 18 young people, advice, discussion, counselling, a range of things. Now, this was 10, 15 years ago. And I would go down and with one or two of us, we would do a clinic with them. And not so much a clinic. If they had somebody that needed to be seen, I would see them. We'd have MDTs with them and whatever. And it taught me an awful lot of working together with third sector. And then we increased it and we got child mental health coming into the same group. We linked it to commission and provision of all children's services. We organised a contract that was separate to the adult addiction. We said it was up to 18 services, up to 18 but flexible entirely. We used the principles that were in the practice parameters. And what we had was, I think the staffing was critical. We had a child psychiatrist, not a full-time child psychiatrist, but we had sessions from a child psychiatrist. And they had often a CPN or a team, but child-orientated and adolescent. I was the addiction psychiatrist, but we also had one or two of our workers here. We had youth workers in the thing. We had teacher experience. We had a teacher who had left the school and was now working as a sort of a youth worker, but also doing teaching. We had linked into safeguarding and we had social work time to look at it all. And we still continued with the drop into the third sector. So it was that collaboration together. And we had essential that parents were involved. Now, sometimes we didn't do that, but it was a proactive discussion to have parents involved. It worked very well for a while. We used it particularly because there was a lot of opiates being used, so I was able to prescribe. We kept the prescriptions separate. We moved them into a different area. And I think working together in that whole group, we all learned from each other, which was hugely important. But what happened? 2010, 11, 12, austerity hit England. One or two staff begin to leave. And that's the worry. If you are leaving it to champions to manage a service and one or two leave, you have no infrastructure. And that was a big problem. Commissioning changed and they said drug use is reducing, you don't need as much money. Different commissioners who didn't agree with this at all, we'll all put it into one big addiction service. You shouldn't have your special clinic, Eilish. and etc. Local and national support began to change as money began to reduce. And this wasn't, there was a lot, we had a college psychiatry, child psychiatry group that were involved in this, and it became reduced and reduced. I did feel though the college didn't support very well, and it wasn't integrated enough because as people left, there was nobody to take their place. And we didn't do enough research, without a doubt. So this is what's happening now, and I'll just be 5 minutes. And am I all right for time, Gary? So if you're looking at the issues for young people's provision now, recent prevalence data and other indicators suggesting drug use is rising, but we still don't know. We don't know if it's in particular areas or particular drugs or what. Evidence, and there is clear evidence in the UK, I'm quite sure it's the same over there, but I'm not sure in Ireland. It's lovely to hear the Northern Ireland accents, guys, lovely. But evidence that young people treatment is contracting and budget is a huge issue. We must have lost 30 to 40% of the budget in young people services over the last 7 or 8 years in England. The complex system involving local authorities, CCGs, which are the GP prescribing, and NHS England, very difficult to coordinate and manage. Now, these are points from Dame Carol Black's reports. They're not mine. These are national points. The workforce issue is hugely important, both for professionals, young people's services, and how you manage. Young people's treatment services are provided all the targeted interventions and the brief interventions, that none of that is recorded on NDTMS, the database we use in England, so we don't actually know how much is being done. And there's pretty much lack of services providing resilience, such as the youth work provision has been decimated, and outreach with hard to reach groups decimated in England. So commission principles are what there should do is, and there's a load of documents on this, they're encouraged to make a range of specialist drug available. This is all, of course, they would say this, in line with the evidence base and best practice, and be developed by a skilled workforce. Who couldn't agree with that? But it doesn't happen. Local authorities are encouraged to adopt prevention approaches, and they should, in line with the nice documents I've sent you. And everything is local authority here. That's a very nice document from NIDA, and again showing the range of services and probably more that they should have. You can have these. I'm skipping this, I'm skipping that. 3 recommendations that have come out in terms of young people from Dame Carol Black's. The Department of Education make an assessment of support available to teachers in rolling out their new relationship, health and sex education. Sorry, I don't know enough about that, but I think it's hugely important. But it should be evaluated, and we should be putting it all together. And then there's another recommendations to invest in age-appropriate evidence-based services. And then this is a further recommendation that the Department of Health and Social Care make increased funding available to specialist substance misuse services to improve capacity and quality. Yeah, but you need to be clear what capacity and quality mean before you improve them. And there is, through the National Commissioning Quality Standards, ensure that these are linked with other services for vulnerable young people, and that family intervention are more widely available. So it's kind of maybe beginning to come back to get family involved, linked with vulnerable young people services. Now, these quality services standards, they're only for England. They're ongoing at the moment. There was just a meeting last week for the first one. But Northern Ireland did have observership on it. And on the next group, once I get it, I'm very happy to say send it to Anne, and it can be sent round, because it is important in terms of what the quality standards for commission should be. And just my last slide, I would say engagement of the young person and their family, crucially important in any service you set up. But there should be a skilled analysis of the young person's difficulties. And that isn't just drug use. It's mental health disorders, it's developmental problems, it's learning disability, it's life circumstances, it's everything. You engage local systems so that they can work together. There should be coordinated, well-led interventions that mobilise all the resources from communities, from safeguarding, education, training, mental health and accommodation, mobilising together. You allow follow-up to detect further episodes of support. So it isn't just do it and get out. Continuity of care is hugely important. And that's why the transition is hugely important. And then you need training. I shall leave it at that. Shall I stop sharing, Gary?
Yes, please. Thank you, Eilish. You covered an awful lot of ground there. And I think that some of the issues you've raised will certainly appear again within the discussion. So thank you for that. I mean, you raise I'm going to do some of the questions. We're going to go into a kind of panel discussion now in the last 25 minutes or so that we have left. And there's a lot of kind of issues coming up within the comments coming up within the question and answers and the Q&A box. But I'm trying to see how to link those through to some of the issues that are coming up through the presentations as well. I suppose one of the themes kind of coming through is around this engagement, around not just, you know, engaging with the young person, but engaging with the family. And I think historically, you know, that's a very, very challenging thing, because you've got families who are seeking help because the young person isn't seeking help. And you've also then got young people who are difficult to engage, and you know, the family's uncertain about what their role is within that. And then I think also you have where there is engagement, you have where, you know, what's going on within the family is a factor, and you know, other family members really just want you to fix the problem with the young person, but actually the family dynamic is part of the problem. So I'd like to kind of put the panel kind of first around, you know, what's the best, any thoughts on how how you approach getting good engagement with families, but where families are, but also where what works around not just involving families, but having a family-based approach to supporting the young person.
I think what Eilish was saying there about not providing just family work or family systemic work or family therapy solely on its own, it's taking that holistic approach. And that goes back to thorough assessment and the needs of the young person and involving the young person in that assessment and families. You know, it can be a jigsaw puzzle. It can be, you know, you have to go around the houses sometimes in terms of when and how and choice and readiness and all those different things. Again, you know, it's given people time as well to get their head around some of the issues. And I suppose one of the things that we would challenge is, Jimmy's not the problem, you know, let's look at this beyond, you know, the young person who's the one that's presenting with the issues. And it's about encouraging, engaging families and gaining their understanding about it, I suppose, beyond the presenting issue. So that can be the practitioner's challenge. But again, it's about working as a team, working in partnership. I think one of the other issues, it depends on who's referred the young person as well. We all know in terms of particularly other professionals, depending on what their experiences have been in relation to drugs and alcohol. One of the things I would say is it needs to go right back to, and I've said this many times, when we're training people in their chosen professions, is that substance use is a, you know, cradle to grave issue, and it needs to be enshrined in a lot of in every part of the training. So I suppose sometimes we feel as practitioners that once the referral is made to a drug and alcohol service, that's sorted. And again, it's developing that partnership work as well. So there's a lot of different elements, I think, that needs to come in. But the family-centered stuff, I'm interested in what Eilish said there about the services being up to 18 and then a youth service after that. And do we look at that differently because of statutory involvement, because of the Children's Order, Children's Act? You know, do we have a different emphasis and responsibilities? That's something I would like to reflect on, I think, as well. But anyway, we'll go back to the family stuff. But I think family focused, I think we need to develop that further, and not just the young person presenting with the issues.
Anybody else like to jump in on that?
I'd make a comment that you said sometimes the family comes forward because the child can't be engaged for some reason, but actually they need support. It may not be Addiction World that does that. There are different services. So I'm not on, and I've just got a thing to say my internet connection is unstable. Eek! Can you still hear me?
Yes, you've come across fine.
Oh God, this IT area is driving me mad. But the most important thing is if you help the family and inform them, tell them how dangerous, not dangerous, don't scare them, but be credible. Don't ever try to scare, but you have to be credible on the drug use. Then that might actually help the young person to engage, because then they know how to deal with intoxication. They need to know how to put some ground rules that aren't punitive. They need to help with interdependence. So I think that's great. You need to involve them.
And we would offer support that even when the young person doesn't engage at all, but we can see that impact as well. And sometimes, you know, supporting parents to develop their skills in terms of the parenting skills and growing their confidence is enough. And we're not there to, you know, wave a magic wand. We're there to support them in what, you know, as a platform, what they're already doing that's positive. But also one of the things we talk about is getting parents to stop. What you're doing isn't working right now. So give yourself a break, step back, and let's support you in looking at different approaches. And sometimes that's a relief for parents, that they know that they can have that break, because it can be really, really challenging for them. So yeah, we're not, sometimes I think that approach just with parents first and given the focus first is really valuable.
Yeah, interestingly, since the pandemic, we have seen in some cases a decrease of engagement with young people, but an increase of engagement with parents, because obviously parents have been locked up for periods of time with their kids, and the problems continue, and we've had definitely a spike in parents seeking help around how do I deal with what's going on here, and how can I speak to, or you know, how do I respond to this kind of situation. So I think that there is an opportunity to have greater focus on engagement and supporting parents in order to be able to support.
But can I give a tiny little lesson that I learned 20 years ago, and so did our service. A mother came into the third sector with her child, sort of pushing him in and saying, he's using cannabis, isn't this terrible? And she made a complaint later because she heard a therapist say, which was wrong, to the young person, your biggest problem about your use of cannabis is you shouldn't have told your mother about it, which of course was shocking. But when you talk to the mother, she wasn't hugely worried about the occasional spliff. What she was worried was she was in a total panic, and she saw cannabis, gateway to heroin use, prison, death, etc. And she had just gone off because of her panic. And what she needed was just to be calmed down. So you find out what the parents are worried about. Because if you have a 16-year-old who's using cannabis, you do begin to worry, what might it be? And all she needed was to just have a few calming down sessions. So just sometimes find out where they're at, rather than necessarily we say this is what it should be, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we would be providing, you know, systemic work and family support, where, you know, working with the young person, working with the family members, and then potentially together in order to kind of unpick different perceptions are, you know, and what's real and what's imagined in terms of how each are kind of, you know, interacting is a really beneficial way of kind of moving things forward, because often what's going on is how people are acting out is not because of the reasons that the other people in the family think it is. Oh, anybody else want to come in on the family issue before we move on to another kind of theme?
I quickly add, there's a parent peer support group that we are starting online. If you know of parents who can, who want to be supported in a space where they can just come and vent. I know we've talked about all the therapeutic avenues we can take, but this is just a space for an hour over lunch where other parents can get together and feel like they're, not alone. They're not alone struggling or on their own, but, maybe vent. So it's starting at the end of the month. I'll put it in the chat. So yeah, you can get in touch with us.
Okay, and whenever we're saying like after this event, we will include information on those types of things as well, so that people have access to some of those local services. Another issue kind of coming through in the chat here is around, that obviously, a common thread that went through the presentations was the high incidence and the relationship between substance use and mental health issues with young people. I think that this relates also to the issue in relation to under 18s and over 18s, and the fact that services are constructed generally around that kind of under 18 and over 18 kind of interfaces. But also there's a lot of separation between mental health and drug and alcohol services, both within for under 18s and for over 18s that are very different. And there's comments here around, and some of the comments are coming from the kind of homeless sector, but where their experience, I think, is translatable across a lot of others, where because there are dual diagnosis, coexisting issues with young people, is that sometimes it's very difficult for them to be able to navigate between how they get those supports. And we know that there is an ongoing kind of debate around a pillar to post kind of approach between substance use and mental health. But often then, whether it's the others who are working with those young people in other services, or even with back to this issue about the family and parents, they're left with kind of managing the behaviour and managing the issues that are the fallout of that, because young people can't get the access to the right type of support at the right time. And I'm just wondering whether there's any thoughts around, how can we get better at trying to deal with those issues in the right way, because it looks like sometimes they're trying to fit young people in the doors which are closed, or to push them into somebody else's door because they don't fit the criteria of a particular part of the system.
Can I say one word? And there's a lovely document done on comorbidities in, I think it was 2017, 2018, and they said two things. They're more talked about adults, but it's the same. One is it's everybody's business, the comorbidity, and there's no wrong door. So, and this idea that you treat the drug use and then you can transfer over for the depression or vice versa is just a nonsense. It should be correlating, working together, coordinated care. And unless commissioners, though, put it together as a contract, we're going to continue working. We've been working in silos since I started working. The beauty we had is that we got and went within the contract, we put in child psychiatry and mental health. And they were hugely involved because we were actually able to manage a lot of the mental health ourselves when we had supervision and advice and were able to link in. And then if they became very problematic, there was a way to move them into mental health. But I think more working into each other rather than you're available if you need is actually quite a good idea. But it's very hard to get it. The reason we got it was the child psychiatrist was my husband. So, but that's pretty sad, and that's what I mean by having champions and not having a good infrastructure,
I think we've been struggling with this, like yourselves, Eilish, for many, many years. And in terms of our adult population, we've been talking about this in Bamford's report in 2007, and we're still talking about it. And there wasn't much. We had a new mental health strategy, and there wasn't much in that. And I think there was one page in relation to GL diagnosis or complex comorbidities. And that's for our adult population. I'm saying nothing for our young people. And also within our new substance use strategy, it does, because of the people around the table, it has driven that agenda forward. But for me, it's still, we know that the parallel model the integrated model is the model to go for, but it's actually getting that done and up and running. And I thought there was a number of good models within England, that there are instances where the integrated model has happened. I'm not sure whether that's for adult, or you would know of any current good models of practice that pertain to
there's a few still working in young people,
yeah.
But it still is ad hoc and not across. I say it's ad hoc with pockets of isolated excellence, but it's not across the board. As in, there's some super services. There's one in Northumberland here near us. It's probably the best third sector I've seen in a very long time. And they work very, very well with particularly the children mental health. It's often the children mental health that don't work well with them, because they say, we've given 2 appointments and they haven't turned up, so we're going to discharge, you know, the classic. But the worry I have is that child psychiatry, child mental health services, because there is a young people addiction services paid for and commissioned, they then don't see it as their issue and say, oh, you have a drug problem, go to the drug service, rather than we'll hold you and we'll work together on it. And that's what I find is the problem of setting up a separate addiction service, especially for under 18s, when it's not linked with the children's services.
Yeah, I think we have one good model of service provision here, and there are several good models, but just one that comes to mind is Dr. Daniel Gilvarry. There's the dog barking, of course. Dr. Daniel Gilvarry and his team up in cover Belfast Trust and Southeastern Trust, and they bring together the mental health and the drug and alcohol stuff at the same time, and that model has worked. They use the model to stabilize, motivate, and treat. Now that dog hasn't barked in about 4 days, so I just removed the dog.
Can I quickly add, that's exactly what we do in our service. We are working with our clients, you know, supporting them around the mental health, but also substance use. Sorry, Anne, you're back.
No, sorry. Thank you for filling in there.
No, that's what I wanted to say. And what we've noticed is we spend more time working, you know, with their mental health concerns and trauma, and less about their substance use, which actually works because they're using because of other reasons, you know. And yeah, substance use and harm reduction is kind of down the line. But back to you, Anne.
I think if anything, just to make a comment about this, I think if anything, what you have is that within the voluntary sector, a lot of young people with mental health issues are being held and supported there, because they've definitely getting access to statutory mental health services because of capacity and thresholds. So most young people with mental health issues are undiagnosed in terms of mental health issues. And there's a lot of expectation on the voluntary sector workforce in order to be, you know, addiction workers and youth workers and social workers and mental health workers. And I think it throws up a huge kind of issue around kind of capacity, but also, you know, how connected and joined up those mental health and young people services and addiction services are, so that it's got the right people with the right skills within them, but also that their people are there to work through a system instead of just parts of the system, and everybody's looking at their own part. I think that's a huge challenge for integration. I mean, I think there's a question around whether we can look at, you know, how can you have a virtual multidisciplinary team across different services? Any other kind of contributions around this? Okay, we've got a question around kind of, you know, legislation and regulation. Cannabis is one of those, is the most commonly used drug among young people. And, you know, I had a colleague who said the other day, interestingly, said, you know, when we were talking around assessments to young people, sometimes you have to check that you've asked them about cannabis, because they actually don't think necessarily it's a drug anymore. And it's just taken for granted that that's part of that's part of what they're taking. So there's a question around, in terms of regulation, would the decriminalization or legalization of cannabis have a positive effect for around young people's substance use? And Anne, I think you'll have a
We start with that one.
about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, well, just going from the evidence base and not on personal opinion, the evidence base from America that's been legalized in, what is it, 15 states recreational and medicinal in 20 odd states, and the District of Columbia and the District of Washington. So there has been some research, and there has been an overarching federal sort of view of it across states, and they're saying that has increased slightly since when they're looking at the different states since the legalization of cannabis for recreational use. But if we go by state research, research was carried out recently in Washington to say, in fact, there was a decrease in young person's use. I'm not quite sure how they measured that. You always have to look at your research to see what the methodology was. But that was also backed up by a piece of research in California recently as well, which saw a stabilization of cannabis use, neither an increase or a decrease. Canada as well also looked at this, but they're looking at it in the wake of legalization, but also in the wake of COVID. And they're saying that there's been an increase in cannabis use for young people, but that's more as a result of the isolation and the stress caused by COVID. And the US have prepared some research on that as well. And they're looking at an increase since the onset of COVID, notwithstanding the legalization. So the evidence base, I suppose, is mixed. On a federal base across the states, they're saying, yes, it has, but we go state by state for research, they're saying more or less stabilized or no, it hasn't had an effect.
Okay. Any other thoughts around that?
I think one of the things we're interested in is when a young person presents for support, we don't really talk about what's legal and what's not legal, in the sense that alcohol is legal, cannabis is not. You know, we don't necessarily get into the nuts and bolts about that in terms of where they are morally or anything like that. One of the things I suppose is interesting is I'm interested in decriminalization of cannabis in terms of having an impact of young people accessing other substances that are illicit or illegal. So, you know, I don't like using the cliche of gateway, but is there evidence to say that it reduces their access to other? I mean, Anne's shaking her head there. Maybe if we want it, we can get it, I suppose. I'm just interested in that.
No, fair enough. It's the question, does decriminalization then act as a gateway then? Would that have an adverse effect and maybe push people onto illicit drugs? Or
does it reduce their access through, you know, criminals to others of the other substances? That's what I'm interested in, because we would talk to young people about, you know, where they are accessing drugs amongst their peer group is where they access it, but are they accessing other substances if they're getting cannabis from legal environments, I suppose?
Yes, but I suppose the decriminalization works in the favour of young people because they do not get a criminal record if they're stopped and searched, where decriminalization would put it under a health model or put it under a fine system and not necessarily criminalize our young people. Mm-hmm. I don't think decriminalization will affect access to other drugs. It hasn't had an effect in the States. Other drug use has not increased in our young people in the States because the drug has been legalized or decriminalized.
And I suppose young people can't access it anyway, because you got to be 21 to access cannabis in the States, do you?
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, is it a moot point across the board in terms of dealing with young people? You know, what kind of an impact is it going to have them, you know, under 18s here?
I still think they will find it where they can get it, because a lot of our markets now have moved online in terms of synthetic cannabinoids and buying diazepam and buying other prescription medication that is illicit, it's counterfeit. So the people will go, the market will be affected by the demands of the can't. I mean, we saw it when the head shops were shut down in 2010. And in the advent of the MPS Act in 2016, shut all the head shops down, but everybody went online to the dark net and got their stuff online. So market forces are.
But we did see a reduction amongst our youth by 75% after 2016 around certain substances. It has emerged again. There was a gap. We did see that, and in terms of that impact on mental health, it was a relief.
Yeah.
But again, as you said, we can access it in other ways.
Yeah, they can. And the people who really want to get it will get it. The methadone now decreased largely. I suppose you're talking about that. The synthetic cannabinoids are usually the preservative people who are part of our not always, but some part of our homeless population and people within prisons because of ease of access and ease of getting through the door, basically. And some of our people who are homeless also choose synthetic cannabinoids when the heroin market sort of slips in Northern Ireland, then they will move on quickly to something else, and the access to synthetic cannabinoids is still a very big and real problem for them.
I suppose for us, the THC vaping or whatever young people are vaping may have emerged like a similar kind of trend. I suppose that's where our focus is concerned about that.
You also see that more now in the NIDA statistics for the states. The vaping has gone through the roof for THC products for 11 to 18-year-olds. So they're having a huge problem with that. So there's a document if anybody's interested in relation to that and how they're trying to cope with vaping of THC products. So yeah.
I don't think we can leave this. This is probably going to be the last question, but without thinking about COVID. And you know, the experience of the last 18 months has been that services have moved online and been remote. And Eilish raised the question earlier around kind of the evidence behind kind of digital support and digital engagement. So I'd be interested in hearing kind of what the experiences are around where you think COVID has impacted and whether that will impact how services work in the future and what issues there are around that. I think that because also, I mean, it had a contribution to issues around engagement with young people, and also around supply because of with the restrictions. There was evidence that people, I mean, across all ages, were trying to get their hands on whatever they could get their hands on because there were droughts around the different types of things that they would normally have access to, and I suppose a concern around that introduced to other suppliers or to, you know, using other substances that maybe they would continue to use in the context of our concerns around polydrug use. And things like the nitrous oxide and vaping became, maybe it was nothing to do with COVID, but locally here in Northern Ireland became more prominent issues during the last year and a half, you know. So I'm just wondering whether there's any thoughts around what the learning is from the COVID experience.
Two things from us. We saw a huge reduction in school referrals and young people referrals, etc. in the younger age. I think they were all stuck at home and very few making referrals because they wouldn't come in either anyway and we couldn't see them. And there was a lot of phone calls, but not great. I mean, the digital platform for brief interventions and things like that and giving advice, I'm not sure where the evidence is. They're all beginning to come back. A lot more mental health, a lot more self-harm, a lot more alcohol use, but not necessarily, and a bit more cocaine use is what we're seeing. But young people are extremely entrepreneurial, far more ahead than we are, and they were able to adapt their drug use. But we're seeing it beginning to increase now again. But we have to be careful when you're looking at young people, addiction services, what age we're talking about.
Okay.
Well, I'll quickly come in. We have found it hard to, you know, adapt to a new way of doing service, but it took us a while. We tried different ways of connecting with young people, but some seem to adapt to it. Some seem to take that up. You know, we offered phone support in the beginning. There were some, you know, made use of not getting out of their house, sitting at home and, you know, talking through their issues, but some didn't engage, and it could be for different reasons. But we've had to change the way we offer support again. You know, we couldn't do what we had done in the past. I was going to share this earlier on, but I forgot to. I used this book with some of my young people. It talks about anxiety, depression, and anger and triggers. So we've had to adapt, but saying that, you know, we've had young people who didn't want to, but there were some who came forward and took us up on it. But now things are slowly opening up. So we can't say that there was just one pattern as such, but yeah.
If I could just add, we found that young males in particular engaged fantastically over the telephone during the COVID. It must have been that they weren't in the face-to-face situation or whatever, but the the telephone and the online support worked fantastically for the young males in particular. The young females still seem to want the one-to-one, but the males, that was only our experience now, but yeah, young males worked, adapted really well to the online.
Yeah, similar experience, young males.
We had a lot of young people who we'd previously supported in the first few months going, I've fallen off the wagon, or I've started to drink a bit more or use more, or also panicking about they can't access things that they had a dependency on, which we did have concern about because that has a massive impact on their mental health. Over the years, we've seen different things around droughts. I mean, I could talk about different things where, petrol use and glue use has been increased in particular places because there was a cannabis drought. So we've seen this over the years, and we know that the different patterns emerge. I think one of the concerns is that young people established routines around substance use that they wouldn't have established previously due to lockdown. Also, their access to particularly alcohol within the home, because we know and there was an increase in 30%, 40% of alcohol sales with. So those kind of things, we're worried that things were established. However, speaking to our practitioners, they feel now with our teams are out and about, we're seeing people face to face, walk and talk, and home visits have started again as well that are COVID safe. That the picture hasn't dramatically changed. It hasn't dramatically changed. There's nothing that has been highlighted that is, in terms of usage and trends, some of the same stuff as same issues that remain there. So that would be what they're advising me.
Thanks. Alan, any final words before close?
No, just thanks to the remainder of the presenters. This has been very informative, and there's a few questions there left in some fantastic questions that we didn't get round to, and I just wonder, can we type the answers to those, Gary, because they are very informed and insightful questions, so I would hate to leave them off the list. So if we can get written answers to people, that would be wonderful. And it's just to say it's been a great presentation, and it's been wonderful to be part of, and I hope it engenders some discussion amongst our participants as well. And if you want to get back to any of us and any of the points raised, then please do.
Look, it's been a really amazing contribution, in terms of the presentations and the discussion, and we could talk all day. A lot of really great issues that we haven't even been able to pick up on. So I think that maybe there's the potential for us to do maybe have another go at this, and next year we'll be intending to plan a similar set of kind of events. So I think that there's plenty of that we could focus on. Look, I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of the contributors here today for their fantastic contributions to this and the quality of the discussion that's taken place. I want to thank everybody who has come along and for their interest, and I hope that this has been useful to you. So it just leaves me to close then. So thank you everyone